Hello again. I sometimes see people suggesting that America cozies up to Israel too much, and this is a result either of the Zionist lobby in the United States or because of some more sinister reason, typically involving a weird conspiracy of the Rothschilds, of the Illuminati, and so on. Perhaps a few facts might, as usual, prove helpful. On May the 14th, 1948, the newly created State of Israel declared its independence. The first nation to extend de jure recognition, that is to say legal recognition, to the new state, just 3 days later, was the Soviet Union. The following day, Czechoslovakia and Poland also recognised Israel's existence. Uruguay and Venezuela did so a few days later, and by the end of 1948, a dozen other countries had legally recognised Israel, but not the United States. They did not offer legal recognition of Israel until the following year. This didn't look very promising for future relations. Israel was a little bit worried about the tardiness that America showed in recognising them. So they decided to try and find out what the American attitude was and how the wind was blowing by having their secret agents follow United States government officials about. One of these people who was shadowed by the Israelis was James Forrestal, who was Secretary of State for Defence. He was already a very nervous man, and he began claiming to colleagues that he was being persecuted by the Jews, and claimed that they were standing outside his house and shadowing him when he left his office. This was seen as a sign of incipient paranoia, and he ended up in a mental institution where he killed himself. Which just goes to show that merely because you are paranoid doesn't mean they're not really after you. Relations between Israel and the United States were pretty frosty throughout the 1950s. It was to France that Israel turned when it wanted to build a nuclear reactor at Dimona in the Negev desert. And it was France and Britain with which Israel teamed up militarily during the 1956 Suez Crisis. The Americans under Eisenhower were furious to see Israel invade and occupy the Sinai, and it was American diplomatic pressure which forced Israel to withdraw. So for at least the first 10 years of Israel's existence, the Jewish lobby, or whatever people want to call it, didn't seem to be working very well. Maybe the Illuminati took a little bit of time to get going in the 1950s. The American attitude to Israel began to change in the 1960s, but not because of the Rothschilds or American Jews putting pressure on the United States or influencing their policies. It was purely a matter of realpolitik. The Russians rule over the Middle East, especially in Egypt and Syria. In Egypt, Moscow designed and helped build the Aswan Dam. Some of you might be familiar with the Aswan Dam. The old temples at Abu Simbel had to be taken to pieces and moved higher up to stop them being flooded. In 1964, Khrushchev went to Egypt and he opened the diversion of the River Nile, which was a crucial part of the Aswan Dam plan. The United States realised at that point that if they wanted to have any stake at all in the Middle East, then they too would have to start pumping in money and resources to a few countries. Israel seemed a good choice for several reasons, not least because it was actually a democracy, the only one in the Middle East. The friendship took time to get off the ground. It wasn't helped by things like the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty in 1967. The Americans were, of course, also heavily involved in Iran, which was their other friend in the Middle East. When Iran fell to the revolution in 1979, that left only Israel as an ally in the Middle East, and so America had, in a sense, all their eggs in that particular basket, which served to strengthen the relationship between the two countries. It will be observed that all this was a matter of geopolitical manoeuvring and has not been reliant upon any supposed Zionist lobby to create American involvement with Israel. It was simply that Israel and Iran were countries in which Russia was unable or unwilling to become involved, and so they were snapped up instead by America. In more recent years, with the end of the Soviet Union, there has been another good reason to stay friendly with Israel, and that is, of course, that the Israelis are armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons. This makes them a regional superpower and the key to what happens in the Middle East. For that reason alone, it makes sense for America to be close allies with Israel and keep an eye on them. Israel could at any time trigger Armageddon, and I think that the Americans would rather like to have a little advance notice of such an event if humanly possible. Israel and America are bound together by mutual need, but do not trust each other at all. They both spy on each other like mad, as I'm sure many viewers know, for all the warm words that they express openly. Both would drop the other in an instant if the relationship stopped being of benefit to long-term interests.